Hi, this is Lisa Amaya Jackson, and I am pleased to introduce this podcast series. Our Category 2 sites have been discussing evidence-based treatment within an evidence-based practice approach, and while we have many EBTs we are proud of in our network, we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we can hear from a pioneering expert researcher in the field of traumatic stress on the evidence-based treatment she developed called cognitive processing therapy. Dr. Resick will share from not only what is the evidence for this treatment, but from the black box of how the use of research data informs the EBT and the shaping of its key elements and application so that it is translated into the best treatment for those clients that are seeking help for the target symptoms. Cognitive processing therapy is an adult treatment, and its application to the NCTSN is not just to learn from research and science, but also that it's a treatment that is being used in the NCTSN when we see a parent's need for treatment intervention as we work with them and their children.
So first of all, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to introduce Dr. Patty Resick, and then I want to talk to you about the series and the Q&A that we're going to be doing today. Dr. Resick is currently a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at Duke University. She has worked in a number of places and has held an endowed professorship, and she has been continuously funded for more than 40 years, receiving grants from NIH, NIJ, Centers for Disease Control, SAMHSA, the VA, and the DoD. Patty said for her that she didn't want me to do too many accolades, and people are very familiar with Patty, but I did want to emphasize she is the developer of cognitive processing therapy. She has published 9 books and over 300 journal articles and book chapters. She's been on many editorial boards, and she is actually going to be presenting on a keynote next week at ISTSS, where she has served as a Secretary, Vice President, and President of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. So welcome, Patty. Thank you for being here with us. As I have mentioned in regards to the fact that we have had a podcast series that I'm going to show you the specific videos on, where we were talking about the iterative research evidence that shapes clinical content and application of evidence-based treatment. We had asked Dr. Resick, who is a pioneering expert researcher in the field of child traumatic stress, on cognitive processing therapy, to share with us not just the evidence base for cognitive processing therapy, but also the black box of how we use research data to inform evidence-based treatment, the shaping of its key elements, and its application so that it's translated into the best treatment for those clients that are seeking help for the target symptoms. Cognitive processing therapy is indeed an adult treatment, but has also been used with adolescents, and its application to the NCTSN is not just to learn from research and science, but also that it's a treatment that's been used in the NCTSN when we see a parent's need for treatment intervention as we were working with them and their children. So why don't we begin? What lessons have you learned through dissemination? What barriers and facilitators have you encountered when disseminating CPT?
Well, one thing we know is that people do better with consultation than not getting consultation. We just think it's a really important part. A lot of people don't get consultation unless they want to get on a roster, and I think that's an unfortunate mistake, because I think you're likely to, if you run into a barrier or some kind of glitch along the way, we can't possibly put everything in a manual that could happen. And so having an expert who thinks CPT and thinks in cognitive terms can help the therapist get back on track. In fact, the VA even got so that even after the people were done with their 6 months of consultation, they could call up at any time and there was somebody who was available. And they had somebody who would be available for consultation. And I think it's important because I think sometimes we get stuck and you need somebody to look at it from another perspective. So even if you can't do the regular consultation, just setting up a peer group of consultation while you're learning the therapy, I think is a good thing. That's one of the things we learned from dissemination.
Right.
I think staying on track is important. It's really hard for people to keep their fidelity. It tends to drop. So going back and getting a second workshop a few years later, they kind of is an eye-opener for people. I've had people say, I decided to come back because I needed CE credits, but oh my God, I learned so much more that I had forgotten, or I realized I've kind of been drifting off.
So kind of functioning as advanced training, but also recalibration of some type.
Exactly, of things that they may have gotten sloppy about. And we do find that fidelity to the protocol does make a difference, as well as competence. Obviously, competence as a therapist is going to matter, but fidelity, kind of sticking to the protocol, which has a lot of flexibility in it. So it's not like we're saying be rigid, but staying on the PTSD for until they're done with the PTSD, as opposed to wandering off onto some other topic, I think is an important thing.
Yeah, our network members, both developers and trainers, and just have noted that as well. That's very similar. Tell me a little bit about, you've also used it in learning collaboratives.
Yeah.
And maybe any thoughts you have about the learning collaborative methodology as it applies to CPT, the way it includes the consultation?
I had originally hoped that the VA rollout that we started would be a learning collaborative. And when I said, can we have that, because it was only a 2-day workshop, and when I said, can they come back and get the next 2 days? The answer was no, we're going to do a PE rollout, and then we're going to do a depression rollout, and then we're going to do this rollout. And it's like, oops, yeah. I should have asked for everything under the sun to begin with. Yeah. We've gotten the chance to do 2 learning collaboratives in North Carolina, and I really do like it because you get them all back together after they've had a chance to actually get some experience doing the therapy, and then they're taking things in differently. We can do more advanced training, and they're getting the weekly consultation between times. But we're also working with the program themselves, and so we need to also work with the leaders, which we did in the VA, but it was much more scattershot, like the phone call here or there to the directors' meetings or whatever.
Right, we work with agencies, we're talking about, usually agencies that don't have near the number of people in it that the VA does.
Yeah.
And the level of senior leadership that probably is hard to navigate and deal with.
Right.
Can't even imagine. How have you approached promoting fidelity to CPT?
The traditional way of doing it in research is very cumbersome. That means they're audio or videotaping sessions. Right. And then somebody who is independent but knows the protocol has sheets and says, do they do this, that's fidelity, and then they will assess their competence. One of my other colleagues, Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman, has been trying to come up with a way to look at the worksheets and measure fidelity, and it's actually kind of interesting. It can't measure what goes on that's not worksheet related, but you can pick up on whether they're learning the worksheets or if the therapist is correcting things right on the worksheet. So she actually has done a really interesting study looking at using worksheets for fidelity.
And those are the client level filled out worksheets?
Yes, or the ones they do in the therapy session. So It can be both. They just need to mark which ones they are, and they've got coders, and it takes about 10 minutes as opposed to listening to an hour of tape and coding it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that one's just kind of under review, but I think it's got some potential if you're going to do a big rollout and especially if you have something like a worksheet related therapy, which CPT is very heavily worksheet related. So
when you've done either the advanced trainings or then in a non-research scenario working with clinicians, what is your sense of how they are maintaining fidelity themselves?
That's hard for me to tell because they usually don't bring me back. Typically what happens, I get invited to come in and do the workshop, and then the people get divided up into groups, and there's different consultants who work with them over the 6 weeks, and they're very good about fidelity during those, not 6 weeks, 6 months, and doing at least 2 cases. So usually they start 3 or 4 cases to make sure they finish their 2.
Right. Very similar to what we do.
But years later, we don't have any good sense of their fidelity. And that would be one big expensive project.
Wouldn't that be expensive?
Yeah.
I guess what I was meaning was, like, as you're working with those clinicians and as you're saying, the people who are kind of helping those clinicians to maintain fidelity, it sounds like that serves the purpose, at least in the in learning the model,
Right.
learning to stay to fidelity, and are there any tricks of the trade to that you've heard back from the trainers on how that's working?
I think those key components is helping them really work on their Socratic questioning. I think that's one of the hardest. I mean, you can follow it like a cookbook, and it's not going to be as good as really learning how to do Socratic questioning, because they have to figure the answers out for themselves, and then they own it. So teaching them how to ask it rather than telling them or trying to convince them to change their minds is important, and I think that's an important piece. Also, it's really easy to move to what we call over-accommodation, those overgeneralized beliefs like the world isn't safe, or I must be a damaged person forever, or nobody can be trusted. Those are what I call low-hanging fruit.
Right.
But those aren't about the trauma. That's the result of the trauma. So we have to really teach them to focus on the trauma itself, and that's where the client doesn't want to go. And so we have to keep saying, but what about their assimilated? What about their trauma-related stuck points? And keep bringing them back to those, because once those are resolved, these other ones tend to fall apart pretty quickly.
The next slide is on lessons learned. What resources do you find helpful to both guide and inform your process as you work to shape CPT in response to the evidence?
Well, I think what we want to do, especially when we've been on these dissemination projects, the therapy has changed a lot, not in terms of its basic bones and the structure of the therapy, but we've gotten much better at the wording on the questions. Or what if somebody has brain injury, which we find not just in the military, but also battered women, people who've been in car accidents. We've come up with simplified worksheets. So listening to the therapist and saying, this item is too complicated, we got to reword it. So, we changed, especially over the process of doing the VA rollout, we must have changed the manual at least 5 times. Changing the worksheets, making them simpler. And then when they started doing it cross-culturally, then they really had to change it, because sometimes they didn't even have concepts that match our concepts like, okay, we can do it here in Canada and Germany and Australia, and we have the same concepts, but if you get to the Middle East or Africa or Japan, they might think about things differently.
Right.
And like one of the examples I'll be mentioning in my talk at ISTSS is they're in Iraq. They were in Kurdistan in Iraq, and they didn't have the concept of intimacy. We have an intimacy module. So the best they could come up with is the word caring.
Oh, goodness.
Because people have different concept of what intimacy is. There was one other one, I can't remember what it is right off the bat, but they had to change one of our basic exercises that happens in the end, which is giving and receiving compliments. They had to get rid of that, because if they said, I love your scarf, they'd say, oh, please have it. And I have 2 more at home, have those too.
Oh, so it speaks to how important the cultural issues.
The cultural issues are very important.
Are so important.
Yeah, and you need to understand terminology. I did a workshop in Hawaii, and there was a psychiatrist from American Samoa, and the Samoans have no words for emotions.
Oh, goodness.
Very hard to do an ABC sheet like event, thought, feeling when you have no words for feeling.
Wow.
So we had to move to physical reactions. Okay.
Wow.
So you really have to think about that when you move to a very, very different culture than your own. I think there's a lot of things that make CPT very portable and very hardy, because you're asking them questions. You're not telling them what to think. But you also have to take into account what they have in their language and what they don't have, what concepts they have, those kinds of things.
That's so interesting. I remember thinking about one of the question that I had wanted to ask before, which was often whether it's in all our models, in particular in TFCBT, where we're trying to kind of anchor the child or teenager as we're going through, which event, because many of them have multiple events. And many of our complex trauma models are focusing on the fact that many of these children have had so many, and there's so many themes to that they're, walking away with due to the multiplicity of the traumas and the adversities that are in. And I wondered how you have approached, polyvictimization or multiple traumatic events.
Well, as I said in the beginning, that's what we almost always see. That's who comes to therapy.
Right.
You don't come to therapy after one trauma, you come after many.
Right.
And many of them have had it since childhood when we see them as adults. But if it's been serial trauma, like many instances of child sexual abuse or domestic violence, child physical abuse, maltreatment of various kinds that happen over and over and over again, we still look for one to start with, as opposed to being global, because the more specific you can be, the easier it is to get in there and have them actually dispute their thoughts about that single event. Right. So with child sexual abuse, it might be first penetration. It might be the first time they actually tried to say no and it happened anyway. Or they thought they were protecting a younger sibling and found out the younger sibling was also being abused. So there's many of those kinds of things where that's the one that really they keep coming back to and keep flashing on. So even though they had it happen a lot, with a battered woman, it might be she suddenly realizes, oh my God, I could die. And that may be the first time she ever thought that. And that's the one that really stands out, because he's choking her till she's blue in the face. Or when she thinks that the kids don't know, and they, of course, do know. Just because they didn't see it doesn't mean they didn't hear it or see the bruises the next day or whatever it was, or when the spouse starts abusing the child or children, and that may be the turning point for them where that's the worst. So we still try to find a worst within a series, which is not to say we can't deal with them all, because as soon as you deal with that first one in those first few sessions, you can start using worksheets on any of them. Because once they've learned the worksheets, their stuck points tend to be, and by stuck points I'm meaning their distorted thoughts, tend to be very similar across traumas. If they started out thinking it's all my fault because their parents said it's all your fault, it's all your fault, it's all your fault, then every trauma that follows they're going to say it's my fault. So often if you deal with the worst first, then they don't have as much to run away from.
Right.
And you're going to find it's very unusual to find that they have a whole different set of thoughts about another trauma.
So reflecting on your experience with CPT, what are some lessons learned that you think might be valuable to NCTSN members generally, and then maybe those who've had less experience with NIH grant submissions? And I think I end with the question of what is something you now know that you wished you had known when you began or earlier on? Maybe when you began is a little unfair.
Yeah.
Earlier
I knew nothing when I started.
Yeah, exactly.
Although I would say what I learned was that, people will say, well, I can't try this because I don't know it well enough. And I'll say, well, I didn't know it. Like I just got in there and did it. And you learn from your mistakes, and I think you can't be afraid to get in there and try something and learn from your mistakes. You're never going to get trained to the point of perfection. So I think if you're shy about trying something new, you just can't be. But I was taught in graduate school that every single case you see is a single case design. Every client you should be collecting data on. That should feed your research, because you don't ignore what your clients say. By the same token, if you get a research finding, that should feed back to your clinical work, or why did you do it? That's why I now don't do most of my studies all of my studies since I found out that adding the accounts didn't help or didn't add anything. All of the ones I had control over, we do CPT without the accounts. I'm a big fan of variable length therapy. The learning collaboratives we did here in North Carolina were all variable length as well. So you take what you've learned and you apply it. So I think those are the things that are important. I think it's hard with, it's harder and easier with NIH. Back when I started, these decades ago, they didn't have any such thing as K awards. They didn't have any of the kind of intermediate awards at all. There was just RO1, which is why it took me a while to get one. and I had to keep collecting enough data to convince them. But I didn't have as much competition either. Now, universities are expecting people to get grants. You know, there's a big pressure for it. They've lowered the cap on how much funding you can get, and I think that can be a real problem. But at least I think you can start out with getting a lot more mentoring than we used to get. You know, we used to have to kind of do an R01 and try to get consultants who could get mentoring for us. Wow. So what is something I know now that I wished I'd known when I began? How to do what I do now.
Of course.
One of the people in implementation there it kind of struck me, implementation science is a pretty new field of study. And it's when we started doing all the dissemination stuff, it's not that old. But the first thing somebody said to me is, you got to let go of your therapy. What? You know, somebody else is going to do research and take it in a different direction. So it's kind of like being a good parent and letting your baby grow up and and go wherever it's going to go. In another 10 years, it may not look like CPT, or maybe people won't be doing CPT at all. By then, they'll have found something that works better. So I have to be philosophical about it. So the other thing I think I learned, and I wish I had known earlier, was that you do have to disseminate. Dissemination is harder than developing a treatment. I think you need to do the treatment studies, and you need to change as you learn things from the treatment studies. But you can't just write a book and then expect, you know, if you build it, they will come. That doesn't happen. So for the first 2 decades of my career, after developing CPT, people weren't using it. And I was very frustrated because I had a therapy that worked. The interns, the postdocs, the people I were training were using it. It worked for them, but there was no way to get it out there because people just wouldn't try it. So getting to disseminate it and having people pick it up and learn it and use it and the sustainability of it is I think, the hardest part. And I wish I had known that much longer ago. But then again, the field didn't exist, so I guess I couldn't have.
That's good. Well, I do remember, you know, having had some conversations with you, kind of some who are taking kind of the shotgun approach, get it out there, get everybody using it, but they're not able to monitor the fidelity and all of that, versus some people who are much more as developers and trainers going to like just make sure that I really want to make sure everybody's doing it really correctly, getting good fidelity, and sometimes even that, you know, how much they're doing that, how much control they have can actually come back to bite them a little bit too. It's like somewhere in the middle seems to be this getting it out there, but also trying to measure the fidelity as much as you can, but not being so controlling that it can't get out there and get used.
Well, and that's where when they started adding things like those stressor sessions, because sometimes you're going to get derailed because their mother just died, right, you know, or some major crisis has happened and you need to deal with that. So are we going to stop the therapy? Are we going to come back to it? Are we going to, you know, how can we just incorporate it? I had a client who had cancer, and we just incorporated that right into the CPT, and she did worksheets on it. Yep. So it just really depends on the client. But I think you can have fidelity and have some flexibility built in there, and I think that's where the kind of the, I don't know whether it's threading the needle or walking a tightrope is sometimes, or it feels like it, but I think you have to be open to change. You have to be also trying to see fidelity to what you're doing currently and then see if it needs modification. Are you getting results? How many people are dropping out? And are they dropping out because they're better? Maybe your therapy's too long. Mm-hmm. Are they dropping out because they don't like the sound of it and they're quitting at the second session? That's more buy-in? I mean, there's all sorts of things you need to look at.
Right. Well, I don't know if we have time for, I don't think we do. I think what I'm going to say is thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Patty, so much for being here and doing this with us. And I want to thank Lauren D. and Megan Holden and Emma and Lauren Absher for assisting in the video podcast and making this happen today. So Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
for joining us, and looking forward to talking to you all in the future. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will be glad to talk with Patty.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.